At 5 in the morning, the city below Armin Wolf's penthouse office was still pretending to sleep. He was not. He never really did. Not the kind of sleep that let a man forget what he'd built and what it had cost him. He stood at the window in a charcoal robe, phone in one hand, a glass of untouched scotch in the other, watching the harbor lights blink against black water. Somewhere out there, 300 of his shipping containers were crossing an ocean he'd never bothered to see in person. He didn't need to see things to own them. That had always been his particular talent, controlling what he could not touch. His phone lit up. A single message, no name attached, just a string of numbers he'd memorized the way other men memorized their children's birthdays. 6 hours. Gate 14. Don't be late this time. He didn't reply immediately. Replying immediately was a habit of desperate men, and Armin Wolf had spent 17 years teaching himself not to be one, no matter what he felt underneath the tailored shirts and the practiced calm. He set the phone face down on the marble counter and let the silence sit in the room with him, the way he let it sit in every room he entered, a silence he had purchased, piece by piece, with settlements and severance packages and favors called in at 3 in the morning from men who owed him more than money. Money bought silence. He had learned this before he'd learned almost anything else worth knowing. Silence, in turn, bought safety. The specific, expensive safety of never having to explain yourself to anyone, of walking into a room and having the air itself rearrange around what you wanted it to become. He thought, briefly, of his wife asleep in the east wing of the house across town, the curve of her stomach beneath the blanket, the child that was, technically, legally, in every way that mattered to the tabloids, his. He thought of her the way a man thinks of a painting he has already decided where to hang, with a kind of settled, distant fondness that required nothing further of him. Then he thought of the gate number again, and something in his chest moved that he did not examine too closely. He finished the scotch. He did not pour another. By 6, he was dressed. By 6:30, his driver was waiting at the curb, and Armin Wolf stepped out of his building the way he stepped into every space he'd ever occupied, as though the world had been arranged in advance for his arrival, as though nothing in it could surprise him. He did not yet know that somewhere across the city, a woman was already awake too, tracing a flight number on a cracked phone screen with a hand that would not quite stop shaking. He did not yet know that in 6 hours, at gate 14, the silence he had spent a fortune building would break in front of 40 strangers and a single, wide-open camera lens. He only knew, as the car pulled away from the curb, that today felt different. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. Mira Wolf woke at 4:50, though nothing had woken her. That was the thing about the house she lived in now. 12 rooms, most of them empty of everything but furniture, and still she slept like someone listening for a sound that never came. She lay for a moment with her hand on the swell of her stomach, feeling the small, insistent movement beneath her palm, and told herself this was simply what love looked like in the 7th month of a marriage that had begun 18 months ago, like something out of a film she used to watch alone on Sunday afternoons before she'd had a husband to watch films with instead. She reached for her phone out of habit rather than suspicion. That was what she told herself, at least, as she opened the airline app and typed his name into the search bar the way she did most mornings now. Not to catch him at anything, just to know where he was in the world, since he so rarely told her himself. Wolf A. Departure 11:40 a.m., gate 14. She sat up slowly, the way pregnant women learn to do everything slowly, and looked at the screen for longer than the information required. He hadn't mentioned a flight. She thought of the early days, the whirlwind of it, how he'd swept into her modest life like weather, how within 4 months she'd gone from a woman who split rent with 2 roommates to a woman who signed prenuptial agreements she barely read, because he'd looked at her the way no one ever had, like she was the only unclaimed thing in a life he'd already claimed everything else in. She hadn't asked many questions then. She had been too busy being chosen. She wasn't sure, now, when the silence had crept into the marriage the way damp crept into old walls, slow, and then suddenly everywhere. There was no one to call about it. His mother visited often but watched Mira with the careful, appraising eyes of a woman deciding whether an investment had paid off. Mira's own friends had drifted in the months after the wedding, the way friends do when your new world has gates and staff and a husband who preferred her evenings kept for him alone. She had not noticed the isolation happening. She had only noticed, one day, that it had already happened. She looked at the gate number again. Something in her, not suspicion exactly, something quieter and more frightened than that, told her to go. She told herself it was romantic, a surprise for her husband before a business trip. She told herself this while she dressed, while she called the car, while she sat in the back seat with her hands folded over her stomach and her heart going faster than the roads allowed. She did not let herself finish the other thought, the one that had been living under her ribs for weeks now, small and cold. That a woman does not need to explain a surprise unless some part of her already expects to find something she wasn't meant to see. The car pulled onto the highway toward the airport. Mira Wolf closed her eyes and practiced the smile she would give him. She did not know yet that she would never finish it. Elena Cruz had packed and unpacked the same suitcase 3 times before dawn, not because she couldn't decide what to bring, but because folding things gave her hands somewhere to go that wasn't toward her phone. The apartment smelled of the perfume she always wore when she needed to feel like someone else's version of brave, something warm and expensive that Armin had bought her on their first trip together 2 years and 1 lifetime ago. She dressed carefully. A cream blazer, a silk scarf he'd once said made her look like she belonged in rooms she'd spent her whole life being kept out of. She packed the small velvet box last, tucking it into the side pocket where her fingers could find it without looking, the way people touch things they're afraid might disappear if they stop checking. He had promised her a new life. Not in those exact words. Armin Wolf did not deal in exact words, she'd learned, only in the warm suggestion of them, but close enough that she'd built a future out of the suggestion anyway. A flat in another city. A different name for herself, eventually, if things went the way he'd implied they would. She had let herself believe it the way she let herself believe most things about him. Carefully and completely, because the alternative was admitting how much of her life she'd already spent waiting on him to choose her out loud. Her phone rang as the taxi idled outside. "You're not backing out," he said, instead of hello. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm in the car." She watched the driver's eyes flick to her in the mirror, uninterested. "Are you still coming, Armin? Or is this another one of your almost promises?" A pause on the line, the kind she'd grown fluent in reading. Not hesitation exactly, but calculation, the sound of a man deciding how much truth a moment required. "I'll be at the gate." "That's not what I asked. Elena." His voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted a conversation to be over. "I said I'll be there. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be." She almost laughed. 2 years of her life folded into a suitcase in the back of a taxi, and he still spoke to her like she was the one being unreasonable. "I just want to hear you say it. That this is real. That we're actually doing this." "We're doing this," he said, and there was something almost gentle underneath the impatience, enough that she let herself hold on to it the way she'd held on to every scrap he'd ever handed her. The call ended before she could ask him anything else, before she could ask, for instance, why a man so certain of his own future had never once let her meet a single person from his life outside the hotel rooms and the borrowed hours. She looked out the window instead, watching the city slide past in the gray pre-dawn light, and touched the velvet box through the fabric of her bag like a woman checking a pulse. The taxi merged onto the airport road. Somewhere ahead, under the same brightening sky, 2 other cars were converging on the same terminal, carrying 2 other people who did not yet know her name. Elena did not know theirs either. Not yet. But by noon, the whole world would. Gate 14 smelled of recycled air and burnt coffee, the particular sterile hum of a place built for goodbyes. Armin arrived first, the way he arrived everywhere, early enough to control the room before anyone else could shape it. He saw her before she saw him. Elena, cream blazer, scarf catching the fluorescent light, wheeling her suitcase toward the check-in counter with the careful posture of a woman trying very hard not to look like she was performing composure. Something in him softened despite himself. Not love exactly. He'd stopped trusting himself to name what it was, but something close enough to ache. "You came," she said when she reached him, and there was relief in it she hadn't quite managed to hide. "I said I would." He took her hand, briefly, publicly, a small violation of every rule he'd built his life around, and neither of them commented on it. They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in hotel rooms and borrowed hours across 2 years. Only the small mechanics of a goodbye that both of them had agreed, silently, to make look like a beginning instead. Boarding began. She turned to him at the mouth of the jet bridge, close enough that the airport noise fell away into something almost private. "Come find me," she said. "Soon. Soon," he echoed, and kissed her. It wasn't a rushed kiss. That was, later, the detail the video would circle back to again and again. How unhurried it was. How a man who had built an empire on precision took his time at a departure gate, cupping a woman's face like she was something he intended to remember. Armin. The name cut through the terminal the way a struck glass cuts through a quiet room. Sharp, singular, impossible to unhear. He turned. Elena turned. 40 strangers with 40 phones turned. Mira stood a few feet back near the security barrier, one hand pressed flat against the curve of her stomach as though holding herself together by holding the child inside her still. She had practiced a smile on the drive over. She was not wearing it now. Her face had gone the particular white of someone watching a private fear become a public fact in real time. For a moment, nobody moved. The three of them stood inside a silence so total it seemed to swallow the boarding announcements, the rolling suitcases, the ordinary noise of 100 people leaving for 100 ordinary reasons. Mira. Armin said her name the way he said everything under pressure, evenly, as though volume alone could undo what his mouth had just been caught doing. "This isn't." "Don't." Her voice shook, but it held. "Don't you dare tell me what this isn't." Elena had gone very still beside him, the velvet box in her bag suddenly the heaviest thing she'd ever carried. She looked at Mira, really looked, for the first time registering her not as an obstacle or a rumor, but as a pregnant woman standing alone in an airport, blindsided in front of strangers, and something in Elena's chest cracked open in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Mira, I didn't know," Elena started. "Stop talking," Mira said, not unkindly, just exhausted. The words of a woman who had spent months refusing to know something her body had already understood. Her knees buckled slightly. A stranger's hand shot out to steady her elbow. Armin stepped toward his wife. She stepped back. Phones were still recording. Somewhere near the coffee kiosk, a teenager had already captioned the video before it finished uploading. "Mira," Armin said again, softer now, reaching for the version of his voice that had always worked on her before. "Let me explain. You had 6 hours," she said. "You had a whole marriage. You could have explained at any point before this." The gate agent called final boarding. No one moved. The three of them stood frozen under the terminal lights. Husband, wife, and the woman who had believed herself the future, while around them, ordinary travelers filmed the exact moment a silence built over years finally, publicly, broke. Mira's hand tightened on her stomach. Her breath caught oddly. Then she went down. By the time the ambulance reached the airport, the video already had 400,000 views. It moved the way these things always did. A stranger's shaky 9 seconds of footage, a kiss, a name shouted across a terminal, a pregnant woman collapsing near a security barrier, stitched together with captions no one had asked for, and shared by people who would never know any of their names beyond what a headline gave them. By noon, Billionaire airport scandal was trending in 3 countries. By evening, Armin Wolf's company had issued a statement so carefully worded it said nothing at all, which was, of course, exactly its purpose. Mira was admitted to Lansbury Memorial under observation. Elevated blood pressure, mild contractions, a fright her body had taken more seriously than her mind had let her yet. The doctors used words like stable and precautionary, but the ward outside her room filled quickly with hospital security, keeping reporters at the far end of the hallway, and no one used the word routine. It was there, in a corridor smelling of antiseptic and cut flowers gone slightly too sweet, that Detective Priya Anand first appeared, not summoned by any crime, not yet, but by a supervisor who'd watched the video twice and said, quietly, "Something about this doesn't sit right. Go take a look." Anand was in her 40s, unhurried in a way that made people underestimate her. The kind of investigator who read a room the way other people read a paragraph, start to finish, missing nothing in between. She'd built her career on cases everyone else called finished, and something about the stillness in that hospital hallway told her this one wasn't finished either, whatever this one turned out to be. She didn't go in to see Mira. Not yet. Instead, she stood outside the door for a long moment, watching a private security detail hover with the particular nervousness of men paid to protect a name rather than a person, and made a note in a small notebook she still preferred to any phone. "Wolf. Hey, shipping fortune. Wife hospitalized post-collapse. Mistress present at scene. Public incident. High visibility. Family will want it buried fast. She underlined buried twice. It wasn't yet an investigation. There was no crime here that she could name out loud to her captain without being laughed out of the building. A scandal. Yes, a public humiliation captured on 40 phones, but nothing that belonged on a detective's desk. And yet Anand had spent 17 years learning that families who moved this fast to control a narrative were rarely protecting nothing. She thought of the husband's face in the footage, composed even mid-collapse of his own marriage, a man performing calm the way other men performed grief. She thought of the mistress, frozen, clutching a bag like it held something she needed. She thought, mostly, of the wife, collapsed on an airport floor, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by strangers filming instead of helping, and felt the old, familiar itch settle into her chest, the one that had never once, in 17 years, led her somewhere quiet. She put the notebook away and walked toward the elevators. Somewhere above her, machines beeped steadily beside a woman who did not yet know that the story of her marriage was only just beginning to be told. 3 months before the airport, on an afternoon that had felt, at the time, like nothing at all, Mira had gone looking for a spare charger and found a locked door instead. The house had 41 rooms by the estate agent's count, though Mira had never bothered verifying it. Most of them existed for staff she rarely saw and guests who rarely came. She'd wandered the east corridor half out of boredom, half out of the restless energy her second trimester had given her, when she found the door at the end of the hall standing slightly ajar for the first time in the 8 months she'd lived there. Inside, not much. A desk, a filing cabinet with a lock that had been left, carelessly, unturned. And in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of insurance papers that meant nothing to her, a small brass key attached to a paper tag that read only Unit 114, Meridian Storage. She hadn't known what had opened. She still didn't. She'd slipped it into her jewelry box before anyone found her standing there, and had thought about it, on and off, in the quiet hours since. A small cold weight at the edge of her mind. The way an unanswered question sits differently than an answered one. She'd asked his mother about it once, carefully, over tea in the good parlor, framing it as idle curiosity. Does Armin keep a storage unit somewhere? Meridian, I think. Delphine Wolfe had not looked up from her cup. Armin keeps a great many things, dear. It isn't a wife's job to catalog them. I wasn't trying to catalog anything. I found a key. Then I'd put it back where you found it. Delphine's voice stayed light, pleasant even. But something underneath it had gone very still, the particular stillness of a woman choosing her next words with more care than the conversation seemed to warrant. My son doesn't like being managed, Mira, even by people who love him, especially by them. I'm not trying to manage him. I'm trying to know him. Delphine had smiled then, the smile of a woman who had learned, decades ago, exactly how much truth a marriage could survive. Some things are kinder left unknown. You'll understand that, eventually. I did. The word eventually had stayed with Mira longer than anything else in that conversation. The quiet suggestion that Delphine herself had once gone looking for a door like this one, and had learned, at some cost the older woman never named, to stop. Mira had put the key back in her jewelry box instead of the drawer. She told herself she'd forget about it. She hadn't. In the weeks after, she found herself watching her husband differently. Not with suspicion exactly, not yet, but with the low-grade attentiveness of someone who has learned that a house can hold rooms even the person who owns it doesn't fully explain. She noticed how carefully he curated what she saw of his past. How photographs before their marriage seemed to exist only in the years immediately preceding it, as if his life before then had been edited down to nothing worth keeping. She thought of it again now, 3 months later, lying in a hospital bed with monitors tracking a heartbeat that wasn't only hers, and understood, with the particular clarity illness sometimes grants, that the locked room and the airport and the woman in the cream blazer were not 3 separate betrayals. They were the same one, worn into different shapes. Somewhere in the house she might never sleep in again, a brass key sat in a jewelry box, waiting for someone brave enough to finally use it. Elena Cruz had not slept, and it showed in the flat fluorescent light of the small interview room where Detective Anand had asked, politely enough, if she'd mind answering a few questions. She hadn't been arrested. No one had said the word crime to her yet. Only incident, only statement. only the careful bureaucratic language that made everything sound smaller than it felt. She sat with her hands folded on the table, the velvet box long since abandoned in a suitcase she hadn't unpacked, and waited for the detective to say whatever it was she'd come to say. "You've been seeing Mr. Wolf for 2 years, Anand said. Not a question. You already know that. I know what 40 strangers filmed. I don't know what 2 years looks like from where you were standing." Anand's voice carried no judgment, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Help me understand it." Elena studied her for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, laughed, a short, unhappy sound. "You want to know if I loved him? I want to know what you knew." That distinction landed somewhere Elena hadn't braced herself for. She looked down at her folded hands and, slowly, began talking, not about love, though love was tangled through all of it whether she wanted it there or not, but about numbers. Small things at first. An offshore account Armin had once mentioned in passing, laughing, the way rich men laugh about money the rest of the world takes seriously. A lawyer's name that came up more than business should have required. A pattern, over months, of transfers she hadn't been meant to see on a laptop left open one careless morning. "I started writing it down," Elena admitted. "Not because I don't know what I thought. Insurance, maybe. In case he ever decided I was a liability instead of a..." She stopped herself before the word promise could leave her mouth, because saying it out loud, in this room, made it sound as foolish as it now felt. "You kept a ledger," Anand said. "I kept notes. On my phone mostly. Some documents I photographed when he wasn't looking." Elena's jaw tightened. "I told myself it was for us. In case something ever went wrong with the business, and he needed someone who understood it. Now I think..." She exhaled hard through her nose. "Now I think some part of me always knew I might need it for something else. For leverage. For protection." Elena's eyes finally lifted, sharp now, some of the humiliation burning off into something closer to anger. You don't get to be the only woman in a rich man's life without learning that love and protection aren't always the same transaction. Anand let the silence sit a moment before she spoke again, gentler now. "Did you ever hear the name Diane?" Something flickered across Elena's face, not recognition exactly, but the shape of a memory trying to surface. "There was a photograph, once, in a drawer I wasn't supposed to open. A woman, younger than him. He said it was an old business partner." She frowned. "I never asked again. He had a way of making questions feel like accusations." Anand wrote nothing down, but the name settled into her the way important things always did, quietly and permanently. "Miss Cruz," she said, standing, "I'd like you to think very carefully about whatever's on that phone. Not for him. Not even really for his wife." "For who, then?" Anand paused at the door. "For whoever comes after you," she said, and left Elena alone with a silence that, for the first time in 2 years, felt entirely her own to fill. The name arrived on Detective Anand's desk 3 days later, buried in a decade-old file that had nearly not survived the department's last records purge. Diane Wolf, née Ashford. Age 31. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Anand read it twice before she understood why the surname had snagged something loose in her memory. Diane Ashford had married Armin Wolf 11 years earlier, back when his fortune was newer and smaller, and still substantially her family's. Ashford Maritime, a century-old shipping concern that had, in the years following Diane's death, been quietly absorbed into the very empire that now bore Armin's name alone. The drowning had happened at the family's lake house, alone, at night. No witnesses, ruled accidental within 9 days by a coroner whose signature, Anand noted with the particular flatness of someone who has learned not to be surprised, belonged to a man who had retired to considerable comfort not long after. There had been an inquiry, briefly. A cousin of Diane's had pushed for one, citing bruising the initial report had dismissed as consistent with a struggle against water, not against a person. The inquiry had gone nowhere. The cousin had eventually stopped calling. Grief, everyone assumed, or exhaustion, or the specific kind of quiet that settles over families too poor to keep fighting families too rich to lose. Anand found a single photograph in the file. Diane at what looked like an anniversary dinner, laughing at something outside the frame, Armin beside her with his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that, in the harsh light of everything Anand now knew, no longer read as tender. She thought of Mira, in her hospital bed. She thought of Elena, humiliated on camera in front of a world that would forget her name within a month. She thought, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, that both women had walked into this marriage believing themselves to be the first of anything. Neither had been. Anand drove to Lansbury Memorial that afternoon, the photograph in a folder on the passenger seat, and found Mira sitting up in bed, pale, one hand resting on her stomach the way it seemed to live there permanently now. "I don't know what you want from me," Mira said, when Anand introduced herself. "My husband kissed another woman at an airport. I don't need a detective for that. I need a lawyer." "You'll need one of those too," Anand said, not unkindly, and set the folder on the blanket. "I need you to look at something first." Mira opened it slowly. The photograph. The name. Diane Wolfe. For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and Anand watched something in the younger woman's face rearrange itself. Not shock exactly, more like the specific, sick recognition of a puzzle piece sliding into a shape you'd already half suspected. "There's a storage unit," Mira said finally, very quietly. "Meridian Storage. Unit 114. I found the key months ago. His mother told me to put it back." Anand went very still. "Do you still have it?" "In my jewelry box. At the house." Mira's hand tightened on the blanket. "I thought it was nothing. A business thing. I told myself." She stopped, and when she spoke again her voice had gone thin and hard at once. A woman balancing on the edge of a decision she couldn't yet see the bottom of. Was she like me? Before it happened? Anand didn't answer directly, because she didn't yet know, and she had learned long ago never to promise comfort she couldn't back with fact. "I'd like to find out," she said instead. "Together, if you're willing." Mira looked down at the photograph of a woman 11 years dead, a woman who had once sat across a dinner table believing herself loved, and felt something in her chest go from frightened to something colder and far more useful. "I'm willing," she said. Armin Wolfe visited the hospital that evening, dressed the way he dressed for boardrooms. Nothing about him disheveled, nothing about him apologetic. A man who had clearly decided somewhere on the drive over exactly which version of himself this conversation required. "You collapsed in an airport, Mira, in front of cameras." He said it as though she'd done something to him, not the reverse. "Do you understand what this does to the company? To the family?" "I understand what it does to me," she said. "I watched you kiss her. You misread a difficult moment. Elena is a colleague, an old friend going through." He waved a hand, vague, dismissive, the gesture of a man who had spent his life not needing his sentences to finish for people to believe them. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you put yourself and our daughter at risk chasing a story that isn't real." There were 40 phones, Armin. There were 40 strangers looking for 15 seconds of attention, and you handed it to them. His voice softened, the way it always did right before it turned a knife sideways. "I know you've been under strain. The pregnancy, the isolation you keep telling my mother about. I'm not angry. I just need you to see how this looks. A pregnant woman collapsing in public, making accusations with no context. People will say you're unwell, Mira. I'd rather they didn't have to." She stared at him, and for the first time in 18 months of marriage, she watched the sentence land and felt nothing move inside her to meet it. No apology forming in her throat. No instinct to smooth the moment over, to wonder what she might have misunderstood. "You're telling me I imagined it. I'm telling you that exhaustion changes how a person sees things. That's all." He reached for her hand. She let him take it, mostly to feel, with a strange detachment, how little the touch meant now. "Come home when they discharge you. Rest. Let me handle the noise. This is what I'm good at. Making noise disappear. Protecting us," he said, and something in the certainty of it, the sheer, practiced ease with which he reshaped an airport full of witnesses into her own overreaction, finally, quietly, broke whatever remaining faith she'd been holding onto out of habit rather than belief. She thought of Delphine over tea, telling her some things were kinder left unknown. She thought of the photograph in Anand's folder, a woman named Diane laughing at a dinner she hadn't known was one of her last. She thought of the key in her jewelry box, small and cold and patient. "Armin," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "What happened to Diane?" His hand went still around hers. Just for a second, less than a second, the kind of pause a lesser observer might have missed entirely. But Mira had spent 18 months learning to read every register of this man's silence, and this one, for the first time, sounded like fear rather than control. "Who told you that name?" His voice had lost its practiced warmth entirely. Answer the question. That has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us, Mistress said, and pulled her hand free of his. I think I've been married to a man I never actually met. He straightened, composure sliding back over his face like a door closing, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the narrow hospital bed, a husband and wife, and the long silence between them, finally, visibly, beginning to break apart. Get some rest, he said finally, and left without saying goodbye. For the first time since the wedding, Mira didn't want him to stay. Elena Cruz sat outside Lansbury Memorial for 20 minutes before she found the nerve to go inside, her phone heavy in her bag with everything on it that could either save her or bury her, depending on how the next hour went. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't asked Detective Anand's permission, either, though she suspected Anand would approve. There had been something in the woman's parting words, "For whoever comes after you," that had lodged itself in Elena's chest and refused to leave. She found Mira's room by asking a nurse, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before either of them spoke. You shouldn't be here, Mira said. It wasn't unkind. It was simply true. I know. Elena stayed by the door, hands wrapped around the strap of her bag. I'm not here to explain myself. I don't think there's a version of that conversation that helps either of us. Then why come? Elena crossed the room slowly and set her phone on the blanket, the way Anand had set the folder days before, an offering, or an apology, or both. I have records. Financial ones. Transfers, offshore accounts, a lawyer's name that comes up more than it should. I started keeping them because some part of me always knew I wasn't the only secret he was keeping. Her voice caught, briefly, on the word secret before she steadied it. I gave copies to Detective Anand this morning. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from her. Mira looked at the phone without touching it. Why does it matter that I hear it from you? Because I spent 2 years telling myself I was the exception. That whatever he was doing to keep me quiet, keep me separate, keep me from meeting anyone in his real life, that it was because what we had was special, not because I was one more thing being managed. Elena's jaw tightened. I watched your face at that airport. You weren't just embarrassed. You were terrified. I don't think I understood, until that exact second, that I might have been standing next to something a lot darker than an affair. Mira was quiet for a long moment, one hand resting on her stomach, the child inside her turning slowly, unaware of any of it. I found a photograph of a woman named Diane, she said finally. His first wife. She drowned 11 years ago. The company absorbed her family's fortune not long after. Elena went pale. I saw that photograph. In a drawer. He told me she was a business partner. He told me that too. About someone else, at first. Mira's eyes lifted to Elena's, and something passed between them that neither had expected to feel toward the other. Not friendship exactly. Not yet. But the fragile, wary recognition of two women who had both been managed by the same careful hands. How many of us do you think there have been? I don't know, Elena said quietly. I don't think I want to. They sat with that for a while, the machines beeping steadily in the background. Two women who had been taught by the same man never to compare notes with anyone, finally doing exactly that. Thank you, Mira said eventually, for bringing this instead of hiding it. Elena nodded, throat tight, and did not trust herself to answer without breaking. She left the phone on the blanket and walked out past the nurse's station, past the small cluster of reporters still camped near the entrance, into a life she was only just beginning to understand she'd need to rebuild from nothing. Behind her, in the quiet hospital room, Mira picked up the phone and began, finally, to read. The evidence, once assembled, told a story that no press release could soften. Detective Anand laid it out across her desk like pieces of a hull finally reconstructed after years underwater. Elena's financial records, cross-referenced against the decade-old inquiry into Diane Ashford's death. Cross-referenced again against the storage unit Mira's key had finally opened. Boxes of Diane's personal papers, love letters that had turned, in the final months before her death, into something closer to warnings, and an insurance policy naming Armin as sole beneficiary, taken out 4 months before the accident that made him rich. It wasn't proof of murder. Not yet, not cleanly. But it was proof of a pattern, of a man who married into fortunes and quietly, patiently, restructured them until the women who'd brought the money became liabilities to be managed, then eliminated, then replaced. Anand brought him in for questioning on a Thursday, in a room with no windows and a single recorder between them. "This is a misunderstanding," Armand said, still composed, still certain that composure alone had gotten him out of every room he'd ever needed to leave. Diane's death was ruled accidental. Elena Cruz is a scorned woman inventing a story. "My wife is." "Your wife," Anand said, sliding the insurance document across the table, "is the reason we found this at all." He looked at it. For the first time since Anand had begun watching him, across a hospital hallway, across a terminal's grainy footage, across this small windowless room, something in his face genuinely cracked. "That policy was standard practice," he said, too quickly. "Every marriage in my position involves financial protections." For months before she drowned, Mr. Wolf, alone, at night, with bruising, the original coroner dismissed without explanation and later retired on a settlement your family's foundation happened to fund. Anand kept her voice level, the way she always did in rooms like this, letting the facts do the work fear usually tried to do instead. "Ashford Maritime folded into your company 8 months after her death. You didn't inherit an empire, Mr. Wolf. You built one on top of a grave. You have no idea what our marriage was like," he snapped, and for the first time the practice calm gave way entirely, his voice rising in the small room. "Diane was unstable, reckless. I protected that family's name after she embarrassed it." "The way you were protecting Mira's name at the airport?" Anand asked quietly. "The way you protected Elena, keeping her separate from everyone who might have warned her what protection cost in your marriages?" He said nothing. His hands, folded on the table, had gone white at the knuckles. "I loved her," he said finally, so quietly the recorder nearly missed it. "Diane. In the beginning. And Mira? Elena?" He looked up, and for one unguarded second, Anand saw something that might have been the closest thing to honesty he'd offered anyone in over a decade. Not remorse, not quite, but the exhausted recognition of a man who had built his entire life on a foundation he could no longer defend. "I don't know how to want something," he said, without also needing to own it completely. Anand closed the folder. "That's not love, Mr. Wolf. That's a business model." She stood and nodded to the officer waiting by the door. "Armand Wolf, you're being detained pending formal charges related to the death of Diane Ashford Wolf and financial fraud connected to the Ashford Maritime acquisition." He didn't resist. He simply sat very still, a man who had spent his whole life owning silence, finally, completely, run out of it. Mira gave birth 6 weeks later, in a quieter hospital room than the one she'd occupied before, with no cameras camped outside and no husband pacing the hallway performing concern for anyone watching. The trial was still months away. Armand remained in custody without bail, his lawyers filing motions that made headlines. Mira had learned, slowly and deliberately, to stop reading. Elena had testified once, plainly, without flourish, handing over records that would eventually help unravel a decade of buried transactions. And then, true to the promise she'd made no one but herself, she disappeared from the story entirely, moving somewhere the tabloids never bothered to follow, building a life that belonged, finally, only to her. Detective Anand visited once, near the end, not for the case, but simply to see how it had all settled. She stood at the nursery window with Mira, watching a small, sleeping face through the glass. "Any name yet?" Anand asked. Mira had thought about it longer than she'd thought about almost anything else in the last 2 years. Longer than the wedding, longer than the house, longer even than the moment at gate 14 that had cracked her whole life open. She had considered her own mother's name and rejected it, too heavy with a grief she didn't want to hand her daughter before she could even hold a spoon. She had considered Diane, briefly, a kind of quiet tribute to the woman whose death had finally taught her the truth, and rejected that too, unwilling to build her daughter's identity on top of anyone else's grave, even in memory. "Nadia," she said finally, "it doesn't come from anyone." Anand smiled at that, small and genuine. "Good," she said. "Let her be the first thing in this family that isn't inherited from someone else's secret." Mira nodded, throat tight, and looked back through the glass at her daughter. A small, uncomplicated weight in the world, untouched yet by any of it, by silence bought or broken, by men who mistook ownership for love, by women who had learned too late, and then, finally, in time. She thought of the airport, the kiss, her own name, shouted across a terminal, the sound of a life she hadn't yet realized was already ending. She thought of the key in the jewelry box, the photograph of a woman laughing at a dinner she hadn't known was nearly her last, the quiet courage it had taken Elena to walk into a hospital room she had every reason to avoid. None of it had broken her, in the end. It had only stripped away everything that wasn't true, until what remained was simply this: a woman, a daughter, and a silence she had finally, deliberately, chosen for herself. Nadia stirred in her sleep. Mira reached through the small gap in the bassinet and rested her hand against her daughter's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of a breath that belonged to no one's story but her own. For the first time in a long time, the quiet felt like peace, not fear.